In this video, we're going to look at problems with GDP. GDP, or Gross Domestic Product, is an indicator for attempting to measure economic output. It can be used to give a representation of the size of the economy, and it can be used to compare different countries and their overall levels of wealth. It's a complicated indicator that's derived by adding up everything that happens in a jurisdiction, all the consumption, all the business investment, everything the government does, and then of course imports and exports. However, that formal calculation can sometimes miss things. It misses the informal sector, it misses unpaid labor, something called externalities and other negative outcomes, and then distributional effects. All of these might get missed by GDP, and we'll look at these individually. Informal activity. The informal sector, often referred to as the black market or the gray market, might include things like the drug trade, the sex trade, undocumented labor, typically in the agricultural sector, and informal under-the-table service provision. So for example, hiring somebody to fix your vehicle or renovate your house and paying them cash rather than through formal channels and through a banking system. What that does is it hides the transaction from economic statistics. Therefore, in regions where there is a lot of economic activity in the black market or in the gray market, the GDP will be underestimated. It won't fully account for all of the activity that's happening in that jurisdiction. It's also an issue with unpaid labor. Around the world, women do the majority of childcare, cleaning, and domestic work. This is labor. This is real hard work. Yet it isn't counted by GDP. In a stereotypical marriage where there's two partners and one of them is doing most of the work, that work would be done basically outside of official statistics. It doesn't count. All the effort in childcare, cleaning, and domestic work does not count towards GDP, unless you hire somebody. As soon as you hire a maid or a housekeeper or a nanny to do some of that work, that becomes officially tracked by GDP. So there's a problem globally that GDP might underestimate the total value of labor that's actually being done. There's also negative externalities and other negative outcomes that can be captured with GDP. And I'll talk through some examples. For example, a car accident. Let's say there's a car accident, very destructive, property is destroyed, people may be injured, maybe they lose their lives. But an ambulance is called. That person, that incurs an economic transaction that would make GDP go up. Broken window, destruction of property. Somebody needs to pay to fix that. They are at a loss of time and a loss of opportunity, but it's an economic transaction. GDP just went up. Factories that have output. This can be in any different sector. However, sometimes the output has a negative externality such as pollution. Now, the things the factory produces would count as economic activity, but the pollution is not costed. That is an externality because it affects other people that are not directly involved in the transaction. And even something like forestry or fisheries, taking the last fish out of the Atlantic Ocean would destroy the fishery, but GDP would go up because that is one additional fish that could be sold to market. Now, when we look at all of these things together, these all have a negative outcome associated with them, but GDP went up. And so there is a concern that GDP doesn't actually track good things happening, and those aren't correctly valued. The negative aspects aren't correctly valued in the indicator. Lastly, distribution. GDP is an aggregate number. It adds up all of the wealth in a jurisdiction, all the economic activity. But it doesn't really account for the distribution of wealth. For example, we might have a jurisdiction where every person makes $50,000 and one person, however, makes $1 million. Well, what's the total GDP there? $1.2 million. Sounds like a lot, but individually, most people aren't making that much. All of that wealth or income is being earned by one person. So it doesn't necessarily account for inequality in the distribution of wealth in a country. So just to recap, those are four problems with GDP as an indicator. It misses informal work, does not count unpaid labor, really doesn't have a way of addressing externalities and other negative outcomes, and then doesn't measure inequality.